Now, a few days ago when I saw that Marvel was reintroducing the new Warriors and they had characters with names like Safe Space, Snowflake, and Screen Time, like a lot of people, I honestly thought it was a joke. I thought this had to be some sort of parody created by a clever and talented artist who just wanted to poke a little fun at Marvel. That this could not be real. This couldn't be something Marvel was producing and actually expecting people to buy. Because flat out, this comic book is not going to sell. And no, this isn't just going to be a video where I bash or rip on this particular title or Marvel in general. What I want to do here is first discuss or talk about the actual history of the comic book industry a little bit, and then talk about why it's on the verge of dying, even though comic book movies are not only more popular than they've ever been before or than anyone could have ever imagined them being, but they are easily the biggest thing in the film industry right now. Yet, again, the comic book industry itself is struggling like never before, thanks in part, but not entirely, to creating books like New Warriors. Okay, so one of the first problems many will say with comic books today, not to mention entertainment itself, is the inclusion of politics. Others will counter by saying that politics have always been a part of entertainment and comics, that it's always been a social commentary of sorts. And they are right. In many ways, entertainment is oftentimes a reflection of the real or modern world they're created in. Now, you could certainly argue that's not what people want nowadays, and I'll discuss that more later. But first, let's look at and realize that yes, comic books over the course of their existence have almost always been social commentaries. When we go back and look at the first two superheroes, Batman and Superman, who came about towards the late 30s, well, both of them were very much a reflection of that time and dealt with problems or issues that the common person faced. Superman was an allegory for an immigrant who adapted to the new world that he'd come to, and funny enough, despite this, many see Clark Kent as the epitome of an American, yet he comes from an entirely different planet. And in the early days, Superman took on corruption, not supervillains. And do keep in mind this was during the Great Depression. This was when FDR's New Deal was trying to save us all with countless public works programs, when people were asked to look to and have faith in the federal government for, well, almost everything. And Superman, in turn, was this virtuous paragon character we could all look to for protection to save us. Batman wasn't much different. He straight up just fought crime in the streets, which, no surprise, was a big concern of many during this time. When World War II broke out, superheroes went to war. This is when Captain America was created, and back then, he was little more than pro-American propaganda. He was even seen punching Hitler in the very first issue, which came out before America had even joined the war, and this was seen as very controversial considering many Americans were isolationists. They didn't want to go and fight Europe's war. After the war then, or wars because there was also the Korean War, which of course ended the Great Depression, the comic book industry changed to reflect the relative peace and stability that people craved after such turbulent times. And interestingly enough, they became more or less straight entertainment, minus the social commentary edge. Yes, some tackled the issue of the Cold War, but only a few superhero books actually endured during this era, those being the big three, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And though they survived, they became watered-down versions of their former selves. Things like horror books, westerns, teen dramas, and straight-up cartoon characters became the most popular comics of the time. It was also during the 50s that comics came under attack for essentially corrupting the youth of America, which led to the creation of the Comic Code Authority, but that's a whole other story for another time. The 60s then saw a huge shift in comics and the return of superhero characters in a big way, thanks almost entirely to Marvel. In what's called the Silver Age of comics, characters weren't always paragons of virtue or perfect in damn near every way, like they had been in the Golden Age. They instead became flawed or had problems just like everyone else did. Superheroes went from authority figures to relatable everyday people that just so happen to have powers, or to gain them, who didn't look for permission but instead took matters into their own hands, and this again reflected the times, when young people wanted to rise up and rebel and change the world. Comics also, to use that dreaded word, became very diverse in this time period. More women and minorities begin to appear. In the 70s then, comics became or remained very liberal and tackled many of the social or political issues or concerns of the time. After Watergate, for example, there was even a story where Captain America discovers the president is a crook and becomes so disenfranchised with America, he becomes nomad for a time. One of the most popular books of the era was the Reintroduced X-Men, and I say reintroduced because originally, The book didn't do very well in the mid or early 60s when it was first coming out. And this book straight up dealt with bigotry, but it did it via metaphor. Anyone and everyone who felt different, or like an outsider, could relate to one or all of the X-Men. The 80s, which were of course dominated by the Reagan presidency, saw yet another shift in comics to more vigilante, take matters into your own hands kind of characters, like Wolverine, Punisher, and so on. It also saw books that completely deconstructed the genre, like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Rises. Other characters in this time also became very flawed or had real problems. Not just day-to-day problems like Spider-Man back in the day, but real-world addictions and such. There was also the looming threat of nuclear annihilation, which many books dealt with. The 80s were kind of a dark time for comic books. The 90s then, at least the early 90s, was a very interesting time for comics because the industry boomed and became almost mainstream. It was this time period that I myself started to read and collect, and I've been doing so on and off ever since. Probably, I'd guess, like a lot of current comic book readers today. And though comics still dealt with modern issues from time to time, the 90s were the age of big gimmicks and epic stories, the death of Superman, the breaking of Batman, and so on. This time period also began the flood of cartoons based on comics. A lot of kids who grew up or came of age or were teenagers in the 90s fell in love with these characters via television, not necessarily comics. Which isn't a bad thing, mind you, but they perhaps got it in their head that this always had been and would be the definitive version of these characters, maybe not realizing that comic book characters often reinvent themselves or are reinvented by their creators or writers, which no is not meant to be a defense of the modern industry and how it's reinvented itself. I'm just pointing out that when characters endure for many decades, they often go through changes, and sometimes big changes, again, usually to reflect the era. After difficult times then in the late 90s, where Marvel even declared bankruptcy, 9/11 would of course change the industry yet again, and in the years that followed, we saw a lot of heroes dealing with secret enemies or hidden threats. Lex Luthor even became president during this time, which was of course a not so subtle commentary about George W. Bush becoming president. After that, and since the rise of comic book movies, which really started with the first Spider-Man trilogy, was propelled further by the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, and then blew up with the MCU, I dare say that comic books have been struggling to find their identity or purpose in a world dominated by comic book movies. I mean, you have this industry that, if we're being honest, is kept afloat mainly by older readers and collectors, yet desperately wants to tap into the younger market that wants to appeal to the youth of today in order to guarantee survival tomorrow, which you really can't blame them for. You can't blame comic book companies wanting to get younger or to appeal to the youth of today. Both Marvel and DC, the big two obviously, have essentially reset their universes in recent years in an effort, I'd imagine, to make their universes feel more accessible to those who find it intimidating to read about a character who's maybe been around for over 50 years. And this has been met with mixed, mainly negative results from longtime readers, and at the same time it's also failed to bring in the younger crowd. In more recent years, there has been, for a lack of a better way of putting it, a more SJW push in comic books, which has chased even more longtime readers away, or significantly shrunk their pull lists when longtime characters or favorite characters change in ways they don't like. And unfortunately for comics, doing all this is not exactly drawing in that younger crowd. And the sad reality is, I don't know what, if anything, the comic book industry can do to lure in new, younger readers, not when kids have so many other forms of entertainment to pick from today. Because again, I fell in love with comics in the early 90s, and back then, there was no internet. I couldn't just watch a movie or television show or YouTube video on a whim. I didn't have a phone that I could play games on or post to social media or any of that. And video games were generally something I only played with my friends, in the same room with them. And to be completely fair and honest, if I was growing up today, I don't know that I'd be reading comic books. I don't know that I'd find the time for them, not when there's so many other things I could be doing. And maybe I would because I do love reading in general, but that love, of course, came about in my younger years when, again, I didn't have access to so many different forms of entertainment like kids do today. And so if kids aren't reading comics today, if they're not buying them, who is? Who is keeping this business afloat? Well, it's a lot of 30 or 40 or older men mostly. And don't get upset at me here. I'm not saying entirely men. A lot of women do read and love comics. My fiance, for example, is a huge Spider-Man fan and has an impressive collection of Amazing Spider-Man she's been working on for most of her life. But let's be real here. This is a customer base made up predominantly of older men. And a lot of these guys reading comics, though not all, discovered them in the 80s and 90s and also watched comic cartoons of the same time period. In other words, they likely fell in love with those very specific versions of the characters from the age of big epic stories and gimmicks in comic books and great, oftentimes rather gritty cartoons. To be blunt about it, your average 40-something who reads comic books has no interest in being preached to about current social issues of the day that they find silly oftentimes. They don't care about safe spaces and microaggressions when their top priority is working hard to provide for their families. And the reason they enjoy comic books is because it offers them a reprieve from all of those responsibilities for just a few minutes. It takes them back to a simpler time, to their childhood. And so the problem is you have Marvel, and of course DC and the others, trying to be relevant to the young, trying to give social commentary and be a reflection of the time. And again, yes, comics throughout their history have done this. They have in some ways been a reflection of the modern world, but that's the very last thing their core group of readers, those older readers, want right now. Not to mention, it's not what most average people want today. Most people nowadays feel like they are absolutely bombarded with politics all the damn time, and so they go to entertainment purely as a form of escapism. They do not want to be reminded of what they're trying to get away from. Another thing to keep in mind today, and ironically enough, it's Marvel movies that really started this, is that people love the idea of a shared universe, and by and large, they don't want these universes to be a reflection of our world. They want them to be something completely independent of it. Again, they want a place to escape to that is not reminding them of the problems of this world. They want to focus on the characters and their stories. They want world building and to be taken somewhere else entirely. At the very most, they want vague metaphors that represent the real world, not characters literally named Snowflake and Safe Space. And I don't think the youth of today want characters that are so on the nose either. And even if they do, the question still remains, are they actually going to buy it? Is your average college-aged or high school-aged or younger kid going to pay $4 for a book they'll read in roughly 10 minutes? Or are they going to spend that money elsewhere and spend their time doing something else? Hell, if they gave these books away, do you think younger people would actually read them? The truth here, and mind you, I say this as someone who loves comics and has read them most of his life, is that it's a dying industry. I mean, think of how crazy it is that last year Avengers Endgame made almost $3 billion worldwide, but it didn't translate to comics. On any given month, an issue of Avengers ships, 40 to 50,000 copies? Which might sound like a lot to you, but trust me, compared to the days of old, that's almost nothing. And sure, that doesn't include digital sales, which some say do quite well, but digital sales aren't going to save your local comic shop, not that doing that is their top priority, meaning the comic book industry. And trust me, if comics go entirely digital, a lot of the older readers and collectors will not get on board with that. To them, a comic book is something tangible, something you hold in your hands and read and experience. In closing here, yes, comic books have always been a reflection of the modern world, and if they want to continue to do that today, maybe they should highlight, albeit subtly or via metaphor, how social issues are tearing us apart like never before, instead of picking one side of the argument and turning them into heroes, literally. Either that or embrace what most people want out of comic books, pure entertainment and escapism. That too would be a reflection of the times we live in, that people are just sick and tired of being told how to think and how to feel at every turn, and if they don't believe what you say, they must be wrong and or a terrible person. As I've said before, the biggest problem with the world today is everyone is trying to tell you how to think, they're not encouraging you to think. And as they preach at you how to think, they try to vilify the other side at any and all cost, implying that even listening to them is a waste of time, if not downright dangerous to hear their ideas, when in reality, listening to ideas isn't dangerous, but assuming you're the only one that ever has a good one can be. And you know what comic book I'd like to see? The biggest Trump supporter in the world trapped in a life or death situation with the biggest liberal SJW in the world, and they have to work together in order to survive. Oh wait, that's kind of what the world is facing right now. A global crisis that affects everyone, no matter what you believe. And the sad part is that still, when it's literally life and death, a lot of people can't let go of their differences to fight a common threat. Makes me wonder what would really happen if this world faced a far greater threat than the current one. Maybe I'll make a comic book about that. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about all this. Should comic books continue to try and reflect the real world, or is it time for them, for now at least, to embrace being purely entertainment? Or can they tackle social issues if they were a little more subtle and a lot less one sided? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some comic books. And until next time, thanks for watching.